Now, the Victorian era was a very important, a very significant time in history, especially in the history of literature. But before we get started, and before I answer some of the questions that you might have, let's take a look at some famous authors, poets, playwrights, as well as some of their famous works. That way we get a little bit familiar with what's going on in this time. Okay? The Victorian era is an important part of history. The literature that these famous poets and authors wrote and playwrights all reflect the history that was going on during this time. And if these pieces aren't being taught in schools, kids are going to miss out on the factual important parts of history. It's like taking Napoleon out of the history books. It's like taking Washington out of the history books. These poems and plays and novels that are so popular during the Victorian era need to stay in our classrooms. The students won't know what was going on during this time if it's taken out of the curriculum and not being taught. That's why it should remain in the schools. Well, some examples of this can include Oscar Wilde, as he was a flaming homosexual, and during this time it wasn't exactly well in at the time. In a lot of different countries, you could actually be slaughtered to death for your sexual beliefs. Especially, if they were with the same sex. And he wrote about that rather openly in his novels and in his playwrights, about his love for young men, this passionate, close feeling bonding with just a young man. Another good example I can think of is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She's just such a wonderful poet, and especially talking within just the women's literature realm. lots of these women just wrote about, horrible marriages and how they ended so horribly and just how stressful it was. It just drove them crazy. A lot of them committed suicide or turned into lesbians. But Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote about her love and her passion for her husband. They weren't married very long. They didn't know each other, they weren't married for a long time. But this love that they had for each other was absolutely important and something very significant and important within her writing. And it's just so visible because during this time, that love for your companion was not the love it ought to be. And those are just a few examples of authors and poets during the Victorian era. So there's many different ways to read literature. One of the ways that an author of this article titled Victorian Literature Out Loud by Matthew Rubbery, he actually talks about how important it is to read the literature out loud as a class to fully understand it. I really thought that was a good point because I know for me personally, that's how I learn best, is by hearing it. It just helps me to visualize the text better than if I were to read it to myself plainly. Another thing I would have to say is that reading these older literature pieces, it really takes a lot of thought. As if you were to read something in today's society, it's pretty much just the words on the page that actually mean something. Whereas in older time history, you really had to dig deep and read. You had to look for symbols, repetition of words, style, plot, symbols, different things that were going along. And especially taking a look at the history, there it is again, the history of the time that piece was written, for a further in-depth understanding of that text. But there are many different ways that you can read literature. Those are just a few that will help you completely grasp and understand the meaning of the text. Well, for me personally, I would have to say that I really enjoy the Victorian era because of, now that I think about it, I've read some pieces done by Oscar Wilde. I've read some of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Elliot George, Charles Dickinson. I just really like the flow of these pieces. I like the way they come together. I like the flow. I like the plot. They're not as depressing as maybe other eras or genres of literature. But I do have to say, what I've read in the Victorian era part of literature, I really have quite enjoyed it. Even the poetry, and I'm not a huge poetry fan, it just really clicks to me for some reason, and I'm just really attracted to it, especially Oscar Wilde. He is definitely a character. I really enjoyed studying him. I enjoyed watching his plays and reading. He's definitely somebody I would look further into and actually read a book on my own. So with that being said, Yeah, overall it's just great literature so far. I haven't been disappointed by it at all. But in all seriousness, the Victorian era of literature needs to stay in the classroom for many different reasons, and one of them especially being because it's simply a part of history. Just as any other era of literature, it's just important, it's historical, and without it, it will be forgotten. So that's the point that I wanted to get across today to all my viewers, and just stress how important it is to keep these eras of literature within the classroom, and especially the Victorian era, as there's lots of history presented in the different works.